Most Zoho accounts are ruined because the Zoho expert in charge of the implementation has no idea what they are doing. I believe without a logical Zoho strategy, your strategy is just to ruin Zoho. Therefore, I'm going to show you in this video a strategy that will guarantee the success of your Zoho implementation. Now, I'm Drew Brockbank. I'm an official Zoho consulting partner, and I'm the owner of Brockbank Consulting. I personally implemented Zoho for over 100 organizations, and I've managed over $1 million in Zoho client revenue. Zoho's changing fast and it's difficult to learn, so don't forget to like and subscribe for free elite Zoho training and helpful Zoho updates. It's even harder to get the most out of Zoho, so if you'd like to unlock Zoho's full potential for your business, book a free consultation to get the elite Zoho consulting that you'll need. Here is the best strategy that you can use to guarantee that Zoho will be implemented correctly for your organization. And how can I say that? Well, I've actually done this before, so this isn't guesswork. This isn't my theory on what works for organizations. This is what I know works for organizations because I've actually done it, and there's way too many people online making content, and they have no idea how to actually do things correctly, and they're giving out advice. So use this as your source of truth. And if you don't believe the things, use your gut. You can tell when things are logical and when things make sense. And a lot of the advice given for free online makes no sense whatsoever. That's the idea of today, is give you a logical plan of action for implementing and improving Zoho in the best way possible. Okay, so here's the implementation plan. So just to zoom out for you, you've got the overarching strategy here, and then I've got some questions to help guide you to the most relevant part of the strategy, because it's likely that you could be farther down the line in an implementation than another person. And some of you may just want to understand what Zoho is capable of doing. You might be at the top of the strategy, right? The beginning. So depending on where you're at in the strategy, these questions help guide you to the most relevant part of the overarching plan of action. Okay, so let's start with demonstration. So my argument here for a demonstration is if you don't have an understanding of what Zoho is capable of doing, and if you don't have an understanding of what Zoho should do for your organization, then you can't keep the end in mind. And if you can't keep the end in mind, you are effectively flying blind. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that an expert analyzes your organization, says, this is how things should be done, right? Generally, this is what in a Zoho instance would look like for your industry, for your organization. Another thing that you can do is you can watch some of my YouTube videos where I go in depth on demonstrations on Zoho so that you can say, okay, this is what Zoho is capable of doing at its most robust level. So I'm going to cherry pick the things that are meaningful for me so that I can have a Zoho instance that actually supports my processes and my organization. So that's the first thing. You need a demonstration that will give you an idea of what Zoho is capable of doing and how Zoho should be built for your specific organization. That's the first thing. Okay, so if you haven't had a demonstration, you need that first. This is going to help you keep the end in mind for the rest of the strategy. Okay, at least one person in your organization needs to have a really good demonstration of Zoho. And I can tell you right now, most people who are trying to implement Zoho have never even done or seen a proper demonstration of Zoho. So they're trying to implement something that they don't even know. They're trying to implement something that they've never even seen. How could you possibly implement a system when you've never seen a proper system demonstrated? It doesn't make any sense. So that's the first thing you got to do. This will give you inspiration, okay? So that's the thing you need to ask yourself. Do you know how Zoho is supposed to be used? And then you could even add here, do you know what Zoho is capable of doing? So that's the first part of the strategy. Then you have documentation. Okay, so I have a really strong argument for why you got to move into documentation. It is far easier to create a document of your processes and then your requirements. It's far easier to do that than it is to actually build the system. Okay, so if you make a mistake on the document, that is much more forgiving than if you make a mistake in Zoho. Okay, so this is the homework. This is the homework piece, and my clients will say, oh, Drew, this is so hard. I don't want to make this document. You don't have to go crazy on documentation. You just need to document 20% of your processes that will support 80% of the revenue coming into your organization. If you're a business and if your organization does something else, you need to just document the 20% of your processes that will give you 80% of the results, right? The 80-20 rule lives in everything, especially within Zoho. So with documentation, you don't need a flow chart that goes over every single decision that someone can make along the way. And then you go down these rabbit holes that are useless. Just document 20% of your processes that will support 80% of the revenue coming into your organization. That is the best bang for your buck. Now you may be thinking to yourself, Drew, well, what does that actually look like? What kind of documentation are you talking about? Well, you're in luck, because in the description of this video that you're watching right now, I have a link to what's called a journey document. Okay. And you can see my process laid out from left to right. Do you see a flow chart with every single branch of every single thing that could possibly happen in my business? No. You're seeing logically from left to right, the customer journey. I've documented 20% of my processes at a high level that will support 80% of the revenue coming into my organization. Okay. So because I have this prepares me for the next step of the strategy, which we're going to go into, but this is more forgiving. If I make a mistake here, that's fine. I can just edit the document. I don't have to go and change scripts in the system, workflow rules, layouts. That's way more confusing. And let me tell you this, if you can't lay out your process from left to right in a logical format, you will never be able to implement Zoho correctly. And so that's where consulting an expert could be beneficial for you. Is a real expert in Zoho will be able to extract a good narrative of your process laid out in a logical format, and then provide a shared understanding of your processes to everyone in the organization. Now, keep in mind, this is also future state, right? So this might not be your process now. This may be the process you want to use in the future. That's actually why I allow everyone to make a copy of this for free, is so they can copy my processes if they want to, because guess what? Most B2B organizations are not doing anything fundamentally different here. But guess what? As well, I've done this journey documentation not just for businesses. I've also done this for nonprofits. I've done this for someone who's running for Senate in Missouri. I did their voter journey. So I've done this for many different organizations who've had various needs. Guess what? If you're taking someone from A to B, there's steps and stages that will lead someone there. And so we're not going to go into the steps quite yet. Steps is detailed development. We're going to focus on high level development. So this is the high level documentation of your processes, not the steps, just the stages. I'll tell you right now, a lot of people look at this and they're like, well, I'm going to take this even further and I'm going to document an extra 50 stages. Don't do that. Don't conflate the two. Stages are different than steps. Don't put 50 steps in your Kanban board. Have your 4 to 7 stages per Kanban board or per module. And if you don't know what that is, Kanban just turns the stages into different columns so that you can see your process from left to right. Okay. So documentation is the first creation of your system, but it's in a safe space. Okay. So make sure to, at the very least, before you get started, document your processes from left to right. Try not to go too crazy. The difference between stages and steps, just in case you don't know, is stages are the general phases of a process, whereas steps are the specific things you need to do in order to carry some opportunity or person from one part of the process to the other. So each stage might have like 50 different steps, but those would be different tasks within Zoho specifically. You can apply that to any part of the business though. Okay. So, and then anything above 7 becomes unwieldy as far as viewing information. Anything below 4 isn't really helpful for reporting. So you want 4 to 7 is your sweet spot. Okay. All right. If you make a copy, you can also see, I'm going to make a video on this automation menu, launch plan, implementation strategy. There's so much in here. So if you really want to check that, or if you want the best documentation format possible, use this. Do not use a flowchart. Everyone loves a flowchart. And I know Lucid Chart is cool. Lucid's here in Utah, where I live, and that's great. But flowcharts are not information dense. Or in other words, it doesn't give you the level of detail necessary to truly create the system. And very rarely does it look so clean as this, where you have your general stages outlined, right? Usually flowcharts don't follow any kind of specific format, and flowcharts aren't bad. They're just better for detailed. This is the crazy thing. Okay, so it's not even good for high level documentation, even though it doesn't hold a lot of information, which high level documentation usually doesn't hold a lot of information. Like you can look here, this isn't holding a lot of information, right? It's like a simple narrative from left to right, gives you enough information for someone who doesn't understand your business to just read these out, go from left to right, and understand generally how the business or organization is supposed to operate. Flowcharts don't have a lot of information, and they don't even make good high level documentation. So I would argue that a flowchart is best used for detailed documentation and detailed development, which we'll talk about later. But even then, there's better formats. If you want to know the best format for detailed development or detailed documentation, then I want you to watch my video, Automate Your Entire Business with Zoho, which shows you exactly how you need to do your homework or documentation before you can automate everything and implement everything correctly. Because flowcharts are just not what you think they are. I know they look cool, I know they're interesting, but they are not the most helpful form of documentation. With that being said, use what you have. If that's the documentation you have, I would actually take that and convert it into the format that I use. Again, if you want to see that format, go to my video, Automate Your Entire Business with Zoho. It's a masterclass that will give you an idea of the format. But don't just go crazy with a flowchart. It's really hard for other people to interpret, and it usually only makes sense to the person who created that. And even then, the person who created it, they'll go back and look at a flowchart and they'll have to reinterpret it for themselves, even though they're the ones who created it. So flowcharts are just a mess. I promise I've seen just about every form of documentation there is for getting a process on a paper, and a flowchart is not your best option. I'll just tell you that right now, even though it looks cool. It really does look cool. Hey, let's get to the other part of the strategy here. So we talked demonstration, documentation. So the thing you need to ask yourself for documentation, have you documented your processes and requirements? Go broad, then deep. Customize high-level processes, then deepen them, okay? You can make them deeper later. Or in other words, just get the high-level stages or phases of your process down, and then we can get the details later. Write it as a narrative. A narrative is just a story. Just write it out as if it's a story, because that allows you to expose weak thinking. And it's easy for everyone to understand. We all read stories. So if we can read it from left to right, it sounds corporate-y and woo-woo, but I promise that's the best way to do high-level documentation. All right, document before you customize. It's easier to customize a document than a system. So make sure you are all on the same page before moving forward. Okay, so not sure what's going on there. Perfect. That's the thing that you want to understand really from this is, at the end of the day, if you don't have a shared understanding of your system, no one's going to know how to use it. So get everyone literally on the same page of the document that you create before you go in and customize the system. Get that approval. Maybe you're a solopreneur and you're like, I only get approval for myself, so I don't really care. That's great. And if you're a solopreneur, Zoho's like a fantastic option for you. If you're an organization with 500 or 1,000 people, it's so much better that you get a stamp of approval from key stakeholders on a document than on a system that you spent hours and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to build, when people are like, we actually didn't want to go that direction. That's not what we wanted to do. So that is sound strategy. That is going to save you so much time and so much money to document things first, and to use my journey map that I just showed you, as opposed to trying to invent some form of documentation that looks cool but really isn't helpful. Yes, I'm alluding to a flowchart. Okay, discussions to gather requirements. So in addition to documentation, I don't recommend this, but despite me not recommending this, I know that some people need to do this. So there are cases where I think it's appropriate. But you need to, oftentimes when you're documenting your processes, you also need to document the different must-have requirements of a system. Now, why I typically don't recommend this is, I think the initial version of Zoho, I believe the initial version of Zoho should just be customized from left to right generally. And then from there, you can use it essentially to organize information. And then you can start to do requirements gathering and detailed development. You can kind of imagine it as high level development. When I use that term, I'm talking about this, right? This part of the strategy. When I talk about detailed level development, I'm talking about this part of the strategy. Okay. So detailed development is like you have a circle you've outlined and now you're coloring everything in, right? Coloring everything in would be the improvement or detailed level development. The initial outline would be your initial implementation or high level development. And this leads me to Gall's law. Okay. So Gall's law states that a simple working system must precede an advanced working system, and that any attempt to build an advanced complex working system before building a simple working system will fail. Now, Gall's law wasn't even created in relation to CRM development or platform development or Zoho development. It is just a true law for everything. And when was the last time you tried to implement this rigorous training for your workouts and you did it for a week and then you just quit? You can't skip steps, okay? So don't try to force an advanced complex implementation of Zoho before you implement a simple working system. With that being said, there are cases where you can implement a complex system and then grow into it. But for most people, I do not recommend that. For most experts who are implementing Zoho, that is not the way to go. Okay, so I'm going to bring it home here. We're going to jump back into the doc and we're going to finish off documentation here. So Gamba walks with the admins and users. I think it's really, really helpful that if you're already inside of Zoho, if you don't know what a Gamba walk is, it's essentially this practice where you go in and you see the site of the processes where they're happening. And that will give you a primary source of truth for what the processes actually are. So then you can approve them. And that if you don't do a Gamba walk, or in other words, if you don't actually see where the processes are occurring, this was more popular in manufacturing than it is in Zoho development, but the principle is the same. If you don't actually see it done, you're basically using like these secondary sources to change like the primary source of or the actual place of the process is being implemented. So instead of going into a vacuum and developing all these plans, go look at what is actually happening on the ground floor. Now, this doesn't apply if you're doing a net new implementation of Zoho, but if you already have Zoho and you're looking to improve it, this is a sound strategy for getting it done. Okay, so with that being said, we're gonna move forward to customization. Okay, so if you understand how Zoho is supposed to be used and you know what it's capable of doing, and you've documented your processes, then you're ready for customization. And the idea of customization is this. There's this quote from Michael E. Gerber, and he wrote E-Myth. You're probably familiar with E-Myth. It's a really popular business book. Organize around business functions. Functions, processes, same thing, not people. Interesting, not people. Build systems within each business function. Let systems run the business and people run the systems. People come and go, but the system, Zoho, the system, right, remains constant. Let systems run the business and people run the systems. Build on business functions. So we get a clue here of where to start. We need to start with the documentation of your processes so that we can customize your system and it will actually reflect those processes. So that can still be a little confusing. So I know that's kind of low resolution. So I'm going to give you some more detail here. If your system is like a spreadsheet, right? You jump in and you just see information as if you had just jumped into an Excel doc or a Google doc and you're not able to see things. I'm going to pull it up here. This is going to make more sense in just a moment. Like here, this is really helpful to see information like this because what you're able to do is see from left to right how your process or how your data relates to your processes. So this is helpful, right? Like I can know what to do next from here because I can flip to that journey doc I was showing you. I can flip to my journey doc and then I can say, that's what a raw lead is. Oh yeah, the part of the story, the narrative, the process, I need to move it here. And then I need to move the lead here. And then I need to move this MQL here. If your system is laid out logically from left to right and the records are categorized correctly, it's not that people for sure will use it correctly. It's that it will become unreasonable if they don't use it correctly because you've done everything correctly on your end. If this is how your system works, it's literally laid out from left to right and it's someone's job to move them from left to right. And guess what? You can even automate it so people don't even have to move it from left to right. I'm not going to go into that too much in this video. That would lead into detailed development. But if it's already laid out from left to right, you've done your customization piece, right? The customization is making sure that these stages that you've outlined in your journey are properly customized inside of your system. And if you've done that, you've done a great job for customization. When I say customization, I'm not even talking necessarily about detailed level customization where you have all the fields and your layouts correct. I'm just saying your stages need to be in your system, and preferably in Kanban view. That Kanban view is what I just showed you earlier. If you're able to do that, you are doing a great job. Okay, so that is the customization piece. The idea there is don't do all this scripting, all this crazy stuff before you do the basics. Make sure your customization is there. I'll tell you right now, you don't have to do this for the initial implementation, but it's really helpful. And hopefully you're starting to see this is the domino effect. You knock one domino down, the demonstration, the documentation, the customization, and it logically lines up and flows into each other, and it leads to better and better things. One of those better things is this dashboard here. So I'm going to pull it up. Just give me 2 moments while Zoho loads here. Come on, Zoho. 2 more seconds. Oh, this is fun. Okay, you know what? We're going to wait for that to load. And I'm going to show you here. Yeah, so Zoho Analytics is having a bit of fun there. Basically what it leads to, and you can see this on my website as well, it leads to an executive dashboard where you can see the flow of your records from left to right. Here it is. It's loaded for us. Perfect. What it leads to is a report that looks like this. This is the simplest version of the report, but you can actually zoom into a lot of this with different reporting. So see how first we talked about your processes, then we outlined the different stages of your process, and then we put them into the system via customization. Well, once you get to the end of this strategy, executive dashboard, because you've done customization and documentation correctly, you get the executive dashboard here. So then you can really start to work on the business, not in the business, because you can actually see what's happening in the business. Here's another key thing. If you want to see how revenue is being generated in your organization, you also need to have this. So this is an attribution report or a journey progress by source. You can call it an attribution report as well. You can attribute success to different parts of your process based on your marketing efforts. Okay, so you can say, okay, advertisements have made us 15 grand. Partners have made us 80 grand. Let's double down on partners. Why are we doing as much advertising? Or, hey, YouTube made us 5 grand. Great. That's nothing in comparison to partners and advertising. Let's double down on these two. Maybe not focus as much on YouTube unless there's another opportunity here that we're not aware of. So it helps you to analyze the business and make better decisions and view reports from left to right in a logical way, and then pinpoint different constraints of the business so that you're not working randomly on the organization based on how you feel, but you're using data to drive those decisions. So that is really the key thing, is this process. If you just bear with the first parts of the process, which can be painful, like the documentation, demonstration is not painful. You don't have to do anything. Documentation is a bit painful. If you deal with the documentation and customization piece, everything else becomes so much easier because you've done your homework and you've done your prep. So again, this is the strategy. Do the hard things first so that as you go through the rest of the process, you have a clear roadmap of where you're going and you have a clear idea of what's possible and what should be done with your account, your Zoho instance. Account, Zoho instance, same thing. Okay, so that's customization. The question you need to ask yourself, have you developed your system to support your processes? Okay, start broad, then go deep. Again, this is really the key thing. It's the 80-20 rule. Start broad, then go deep. Getting the broad outline, the broad strokes is 80% of the battle, and it only costs 20% of your effort. So it is very worth doing the broad strokes first. We call that high level customization is the bare minimum. So customize statuses and stages. I recommend you can build reports here too. But I also allude that you can do the executive dashboard at the end as well. Really depends. I don't suggest having a system without an executive dashboard. If you're not able to zoom out and see what's happening in your system, why even have it? That's the whole reason you're doing things like this, is so leadership can make better decisions for the organization based on how the organization is functioning. So next thing here for customization, right? That's the question. Have you developed your system to support your processes? high level processes would even be better to say here. If it's no, then you need to customize. If it's yes, you can skip. That's another key thing about this doc is if the answer is yes, you just skip to the next one. You don't have to go through. That way, you just ask yourself a series of questions and you go exactly to the section of the strategy that's relevant to your current situation. But you should go from top to bottom. I've already organized this, so all you have to do is ask yourself questions and go to the section of the strategy that's relevant to your situation. Okay, let's talk migration. Is your sample migration in the system for user acceptance testing? Okay, so this is optional, and it really depends on how many people are in your organization is actually the biggest thing here. If you have hundreds and hundreds of users, you need to go through all of these different optional sections of the strategy. If you are a solopreneur, then you can skip. You can skip these things. I highly recommend doing a sample migration if you're a large organization. If you're a solopreneur, just get it done. Just migrate all of your data at once. Okay, the strategy here for a migration, to give you a bit more clarity, if we go to the journey doc, and if you guys want to make a copy again, it should be in the description of this video. You can see here's a launch plan, demonstration, documentation, data export, goes over everything here too. You'll want to do a sample migration initially. That way your team can get some user acceptance testing in and training, right? They can test the system, get some training in the system with some data in there from your current system, which after you migrate would be called a legacy system. You get your legacy data in here so people can play around with it. And then once it's approved, then you'll do a full data migration. Could you imagine going to the full migration day and not having done it before and not knowing the steps and messing everything up? Then everyone's ready to launch and you haven't even done it before. You don't want to have that situation. Again, if you're a solopreneur, this doesn't apply, but if you're a larger organization, even a small organization where you just need things executed correctly, this is the best practice. So that is migration. Do you have fields for all critical data for each record? No. Well, you want to do this after the migration because you can add fields automatically during the migration. So don't feel like you have to add the fields first. When you do the migration, it's really cool. Zoho will analyze the different column headers in the data that you're bringing over, and it will add those fields for you. So you don't have to add the fields before so that it has a home to live in. Once you bring your legacy data in, it will create those fields for you automatically. Okay, and I would argue that the fields aren't nearly as important as the stages because when you get into creating fields, you start down the line of detailed development. And what you risk in this strategy here, what you're risking by doing this, if you skip to improvement or the detailed development too fast, you risk not having the broad strokes of your system created. And so many times I see these systems where someone is trying to get the broad strokes, then they go down a rabbit hole and they continue down this rabbit hole and they never recover. So they get about this far in the process when the process is actually from end to end this large. So this is the process. They get this far, they go down the rabbit hole and they never get the broad strokes of the system. So nothing ever makes sense to anyone. So if you can just win this battle that requires 20% of your effort and gives you an 80% victory in the system where you get the broad strokes of your system down, the stages, the high level development, you've won more than half the battle. That is half the battle, is just getting that tracking, everything set up so you can see how the business is functioning. Then you can dedicate the time intensive and capital intensive resources that it takes for improvement or detailed level development. High level development does not take nearly as much resource as improvement. That's why I put the high level development piece first, because if you can get that down, that's going to give you way more reward and it costs way less of your time, energy, and money. So that's the key thing to understand there between the high level development and detailed level development. Okay, so that is pretty much it for migration. You do want to develop around user flow. So detailed development, this is optional. The reason that I put this here is despite Gall's law, right? Mentioned earlier, Gall's law, if you try to build a complex working system before a simple working system, it's going to fail. Some people like to do some detailed development before they get in the system. And there are cases where I'm like, that actually makes sense. We should do that. But most of the time I'm like, don't do that. Don't say, well, in my other system, it could do this. You're moving to Zoho. Okay. It's like dating someone and be like, you're not like my other girlfriend used to do this. And I really like the way, okay, that's great, but you're dating a new person. All right. You're going into a new system. It's not going to be able to do everything exactly the same. And if you wanted that, just stay in your other system. And if you're like, well, Zoho's cheaper, that's why I'm moving over. That's the decision you made when you decided to come over to Zoho. So move into Zoho, use Zoho according to its best practices. And then yes, take notes, say we must be able to do an email IMAP integration. We must have data enrichment, whatever it is, you can take notes of that. But I'm telling you that is not a requirement to get started. The requirement to get started is everything that's listed here, right? Implementation, initial implementation. This is what's required to get started. And a lot of these things are optional as well. So you don't even have to do all these things. When you say like data enrichment or lead scoring or proposal generation, that's all improvement stuff that can be done later. It really can. You want the minimum viable requirements to initially implement Zoho. Anything more than that, you are making it drastically more difficult to get into the system and get using it for your team. So don't do that to yourself. Don't do that to your team. Don't be dumb with all of these requirements that you want. It's like everyone wants that, but you have a limited amount of resources and time. And you have an unlimited amount of things you can do in Zoho. So you have to choose. That's the strategy, is making these hard choices and saying, yes, of course, and don't document because there's other key stakeholders that want to see the 50 requirements that you develop. If your minimum viable system is just what you're seeing here on the screen, then I can tell you are a smart person and that you've done system development before, because you're not trying to do everything at once. And anyone who's tried to do everything at once, that's actually called the Big Bang implementation methodology. You can look it up, has failed. That is an impossible way to implement software. That's when you get these projects that last years and are never completed. It's because they're doing Big Bang implementations. They are not doing minimum viable implementations. So this is minimum viable. Again, if you have a document explaining your processes, customization, the high level stages, and then you have an executive dashboard showing you what's going on, you are ready to go, believe it or not. If you need data in there, another requirement would be your data's got to be in there. But other than that, you are good to go. Okay. You can start using the system. You can do a little bit of team training with a YouTube video and you're good, especially if you're a Zoho or a solopreneur, a Zohopreneur. Hey, we can say Zohopreneur. That's a new thing. If you're a solopreneur, great. You just need these 4 things. So that's important to understand too. Okay, that's migration journey map. If you want to reference the specifics on how to go through an ideal month of implementing Zoho, that's all there for you as well. Okay, have you integrated the core Zoho applications? Here's my argument here. After you do the initial migration, your fields are in the system now. I believe there's core Zoho applications. There's 50 plus applications in Zoho 1 specifically, Zoho 1 being Zoho's most popular offering of Zoho apps. It's their most popular bundle where everything's really cheap. All employee pricing is like $37 per user per month at the time of recording this. And if you can, after the small migration, we'll call it a sample migration or initial migration, you get all your fields in the system. If you integrate Zoho CRM now with Zoho Desk and Zoho Campaigns and all the other core Zoho applications, you make your life so much easier because you don't have to re-migrate data. And so if you add, in this part of the process, if you do an integration between all the core Zoho applications, then your Delta migration will automatically flow into the other applications for you, and you won't have to migrate your data into multiple Zoho applications. You won't need to do that because you did an integration before. So that's why it's smart to do that, and it's according to best practices if you do that. Now, if you want to learn more about that, I have a lot more detail in my ZBlitz program. ZBlitz is just a Zoho accelerator where essentially you can hire our team to do all of these things for you so you don't screw it up, because these things are really technical. And honestly, Zoho is not intuitive on the setup front. On the user front, yes, if you set it up right, but that really could be said about any system. But this setup piece, if you do it wrong, it is a lot to recover from. And it's much easier to get all these things done right than to do it wrong and then pay people to fix it along the way. It's really hard to build the ship, to build the plane as you fly it, as people say. Okay, So that's the integration piece. Make sure that your core Zoho applications are integrated. That's the question you need to ask yourself. Is your team trained? If they aren't trained, you are in so much luck. I used to make my team training programs, used to be paid. Now it's all free. It's all on YouTube. Go watch them. No need to pay for super expensive training when you can get it all for free. So go watch that. Has your team approved the system? Next thing, after you get training in the different apps that you want to use, has your team approved the system? It's smart if you're a large organization to test the system that you've built before you force everyone to use it. Okay. And that's what's referred to as UAT, user acceptance testing. You want to give a test period. I just did a day here for my, ideal launch of Zoho, but you could add, 5 days, 10 days, whatever it takes to get the approval. You want to make sure you do these things the right steps. Again, if you're a solopreneur, if you're a very, very, very small team, you don't need to do any of this. Just get in there and you can make it work. It's going to be fine. You may be thinking, what do you mean get in there and make it work? Do you really want to do 2 weeks of user acceptance testing if it's just you as a solopreneur, or if you have 2 people on your team? No, it doesn't make any sense. If you're a large team, it makes a lot of sense. So it's optional, meaning it's dependent on your situation. Delta migration. Okay. For you large organizations or even SMBs, SMBs, I'd say this stuff can still apply. You want to do the initial migration for user acceptance testing, because how are you going to test the system if you don't have a little bit of data in there, right? And then your Delta migration is all of the data between the time you did honestly, it's just all of your data. You can actually just wipe the system from the initial migration and do a Delta migration, which is all of the data in your system to date. So if you've integrated the core Zoho applications again and you do your Delta migration, this would be better labeled as final migration. Okay. And even then, I wouldn't even say that's the best label, because you can do multiple migrations and just migrate the minimum viable amount of data initially, and you can migrate the rest of your data in phases because you probably don't need it. You may be thinking, well, Drew, if we're going to move from a legacy system, why would we do that? Why would we migrate in phases? Get all of your data, put it into Zoho Analytics if you have Zoho 1, especially if you have Zoho 1. Put all of your data inside of Zoho Analytics and just bring the data that you need into Zoho CRM to get started. And if the other applications are integrated, your data will flow to those applications. Then if you need more data from Zoho Analytics, which would effectively represent all the data from your legacy system, then you can bring that over as well. I know that's a lot, but you're going to thank me later if you're listening to this, because when you get to these situations, it's so confusing, and you can use this map to go to the exact part of the strategy that makes sense. Okay, so that's final migration. Have you launched your system? Launch. Give all added users a setup checklist. So if you're going to launch your system, make sure you have some kind of plan like this. And you don't even have to make your own. You can just steal mine, and I'm completely fine with it. I'd actually encourage you to do so. It's going to save you so much pain if you just use mine. Okay, so if you do a launch plan, plan a date, do the full migration and the data export, preferably the Friday before, if you are implementing or launching on a Monday. So again, if you're going to tell everyone to start using Zoho on a Monday, make sure to migrate the Friday before. This leaves the smallest amount of possibility for changed and added records to occur, so that you don't have a huge mismatch in data, especially if your team isn't working Saturday or Sunday. Now, a lot of people are like, well, Drew, our least busy day is a Tuesday, so it'd be better if we did it on Tuesday. You can do that too. This is just to give you an example of what should be done as far as a sound migration strategy. You don't want to migrate and then have someone go live 4 days later. Then you have 4 days of added new records and hot leads, 3 days for what I've highlighted. You don't want to have 3 days of hot leads that are going to go missing into your new system, right? You don't want to do them back to back. Choose the least busy day, and then you'll be good to go. Okay. All right, so that is launched. And one thing I'm going to note here too, at the beginning of this video, I promise, hey, this is a guarantee that you will have a successful implementation if you go through the strategy. The reason I said guaranteed is success is all based on what you set out to accomplish. And if you can document what you set out to accomplish, if you can turn what's usually very unclear and ambiguous into very clear requirements and a very clear process, that becomes an objective thing that you can say, did it happen? You can just verify. Did we get our process in the system? Did we get lead enrichment into the system before implementation? If you can make it objective, once you implement Zoho, you can just check off all the boxes and you can say, this is exactly what we initially set out to accomplish. And you make your job so much easier if you have less requirements. So only have the requirements that you really need in order to get started, because you can add other things in later. The system will never be completely finished, but it can have the baseline completed. And honestly, the baseline should be done, which is everything I outlined here in the strategy. This is the baseline. This is just what you need to get started. Everything in here should be done before you even move to improvement. Really should be done before you even move over here. Okay. So documentation takes what's ambiguous and makes it objective so that you can just say, did we set out what we wanted to accomplish? Look at this documentation that we created. Check, 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 check. Processes in the system. All these requirements are in the system. And then you can check off the box when you've moved to implementation. And I've guaranteed you with this process, if you actually follow it and do it correctly, you will have a successful implementation, because success will be checking off all the boxes for what you documented. Okay. And then you've got improvement, and detailed level development is a completely different ballgame. Okay. So I mentioned this earlier. I alluded to this earlier, that high level development does not take that much effort. You can do the document, especially if you're a small team or solopreneur. You can do the documentation customization piece in a day. It doesn't have to take that long. And then the executive dashboard, that's a little different. That is more complex. But if you know the scripting, you know how to do it, you can create it fairly quickly. Okay, improvement, you can't do in a day. Okay, so like when you're doing improvement, let's say one of your requirements is lead enrichment via an Apollo.io integration. If you know Apollo, basically you can give Apollo an email and it will give you their phone number, their work history, and everything. It's crazy. That requirement could take hours and hours and hours. Okay, just for that one requirement, we need lead enrichment. For you, that's a simple thing. But when you actually get into the details, those things become very complicated. And if you watch my video on automate your entire business with Zoho, I go in extreme detail on how much these things get. They have like, it's like compound interest, but for complexity and time that it requires to get these things done. Okay, so what you need to be really good at doing is you need to be really good at prioritizing what requirements are actually necessary to get started. Because if you just start throwing things in there that could be done, or maybe this should be inside of Zoho, that's not going to cut it. You need must. And if you've ever studied requirements, NASA has a whole thing on how they write requirements for their technical implementations of systems, and everything that they build, they have to build them on top of requirements first. Their first creation is through the requirements. Their second creation is actually going and generating or making the thing that they documented. They have a whole system on creating them. But there's also a system called Moscow. It's like must have, should have, could have, won't have. It's like a whole documentation thing. You can do that. The reason I don't make a big deal about Moscow is because in the initial implementation, people go way too crazy on their requirements. And they kind of do it as a CYA thing. They're like, oh, I don't want to miss something. Let me check my mic here. They're like, I don't want to miss something. And then someone get mad at me in the organization because I missed something. But then they inadvertently do a big bang implementation and it fails, that's the irony. In an attempt to avoid a failed implementation, they ensure failure by over documenting all the requirements. So what you need to be is extremely practical, extremely pragmatic about the requirements you're going to put down, if any at all. If you don't need extra things, you're like, I think what Drew said so far is reasonable. Just do what I have documented here and you are set up for success. This is so much easier than documenting the requirements. Don't feel like you have to go the extra mile for no apparent reason. I've already gone the extra mile for you and put together here what is most important, okay? And then you move into detailed level development. So you can be in the system at this point and then move into detailed level development. And I actually, for a lot of cases, I suggest that the bigger you are, the more likely you will have to detail extra requirements and do some kind of detailed level development before you implement Zoho or before you go live. But a lot of you can get away with just doing this and just get running with it. So improvement. Let's talk about urgent items, upstream, downstream, preferable, problem, principle, and rolling wave. So urgent items, this is the first thing. When you do detailed level development, if there's anything that's urgent, for example, if you're like, Drew, we're in the system, we did our high level development, but now we need to be able to send contracts and we needed to be able to send out contracts and proposals yesterday. That's an urgent item. So all urgent items should take precedence. Now, you may be thinking to your, oh, well, Drew doesn't understand urgency versus importance, and it needs to fit in this matrix in order to do it. Okay, well, I'm just using urgent items. Yes, you may have your matrix of different things that you're doing, and you might be saying, well, this sits in this quadrant, and this is urgent and important. Sure, urgent and important items would be priority number one. From there, your default, let's say we've done all the urgent things, we put out all the fires. Well, what's the best strategy next? Go upstream to downstream. Or in other words, when you look at this, by the way, if you're confused about this, Zoho just completely changed all the CRM's user interface. So it's called Zoho for everyone. Getting back to this, if you want to do things in the proper order, do your urgent, important items first, then go to upstream, downstream. Upstream, downstream means here's upstream of the process. Work your way downstream for your improvements. All right. And honestly, you should skip when there's a high conversion. But if you see a low conversion from one stage to the next, you've effectively identified the current constraint of the business. This is the current bottleneck of the business. Solve this problem. Start upstream, identify the drop off, and say, this is where we need to start. Now, it's not always that easy, but that is a really strong case that you can bring to anyone in the organization. So let's say you're a CMO, or you're a chief technical officer, or you're a sales leader. You can make such a strong case by looking at this executive dashboard. And someone's like, well, why did you launch a project to solve something here when there's something here? Well, that's downstream, okay? And that leads us to the next part, which is preferable problem principle. The preferable problem to have is everything downstream. The problem no one wants is to have no leads, right? If you have no leads, you have no business. Once you have leads coming into the business, it's how does sales actually get on those leads, all right? They're marketing ready, but when they're sales ready, they're not taking it on. So there's a drop off here. So the preferable problem to have is all the problems downstream. So you need to focus on these problems, because if you never get rid of problems, you just trade them, right? So if I solve a problem here, then my problem's here, then my problem's here, then my problem's here. But all the problems downstream are preferable to the ones upstream. Like if you have so many, like if I had, and I do actually have this problem, when I have so many clients that I have to recruit others to help me fulfill on the promises I've made to my clients, that's preferable than having no leads at all. That's the preferable problem to have, but it's still a problem. And in an organization, you always have problems. It's just solving the right ones in the right order, because you have such a finite amount of time and resources to be effective in solving any problem. So it's really just picking your battles, right? So this improvement framework is the best way to pick your battles with Zoho. And so you've got preferable problem principle and then rolling wave. Rolling wave is a part of our project management methodology, or in other words, it's just, hey, let's take note of all the things we got to do. And then we're just going to take high level notes. And then once we actually get, you got to make sure it's prioritized too, in the right order. But once you actually get to the item, then you further detail it and design a solution. But the idea here is avoid trying to do everything all at once. Doesn't that make you stressed, trying to do everything all at the same time, everything everywhere, all at the same time? That's not helpful for you. What's helpful for you is to get a high level list of requirements and then knock them down from top to bottom as they are prioritized. And then once you get to every requirement, you can design a solution and go, okay? And with that, that is the Zoho strategy. I know that's a lot, but if you don't have a sound strategy, your strategy is to fail. And so you need a strategy in order to be successful. Now, I've gone into this at great depth, but still, I'd say this is a high-level overview of the strategy. If you want to know more of the tactical, practical things you can do to execute this, I have a program called Z Training. It's free. It's on my website. All you need to do is throw in your email address, your first name, last name, and you'll be sent a link to sign up for Z Training. So if you want additional training on this and you find this interesting, please go and get Z Training so that you can learn how to be a power user in Zoho and set it up in the best way possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.